After my show went off the air and hers was coming on the air, Larry King was on with Ellen, and he said, "Whatever happened to Rosie O'Donnell? Her show went down the tubes. She came out as a lesbian and disappeared."
There are friendships that survive Hollywood, and then there are friendships that Hollywood destroys. What happened between Rosie O'Donnell and Ellen DeGeneres is one of the most quietly devastating betrayals this industry has ever produced. And for a very long time, Rosie stayed silent. She stayed professional. She kept the secrets, swallowed the pain, and watched from the sidelines while Ellen built an empire on a two-word slogan, "Be kind," that, according to nearly everyone who worked around her, was the biggest lie ever sold on daytime television. But something shifted, and when Rosie finally started speaking, when she started making moves that nobody in Hollywood expected, the ripple effects were enormous. Because Rosie O'Donnell isn't just a former friend with a grudge, she is someone who was inside that world for 3 decades. She watched it up close. She saw who Ellen became, who she surrounded herself with, and where those private trips and secret gatherings eventually led. This is the story of a 30-year friendship, a brutal public betrayal, a dark Hollywood underbelly that more people knew about than ever admitted, and one woman who finally decided that staying quiet was no longer something she was willing to do. Stay with me, because by the end of this, you are going to be asking yourself the same question that thousands of people are now asking online. How did we not see this sooner? How it all began. The friendship nobody talks about. Before Ellen DeGeneres was a billionaire with a sprawling California estate and a roster of A-list celebrity friends, she and Rosie O'Donnell were peers, two openly gay women trying to carve out space in an entertainment industry that wasn't exactly rolling out the welcome mat for either of them. That shared experience created a bond. They understood each other in a way that most people around them simply couldn't. Rosie has spoken in interviews about how much that connection meant to her during a period when Hollywood was not a safe place for people like them. Being openly gay in the industry during the late 1980s and 1990s was a genuine career risk. Ellen experienced that firsthand when she came out publicly in 1997 and watched her sitcom get canceled almost immediately after. Rosie understood that fear. She lived it too. So the friendship wasn't casual. It wasn't two celebrities exchanging pleasantries at award shows. This was a real friendship, the kind where you call each other, the kind where you know what's actually going on in someone's life behind the public persona. And that's exactly why what happened next cut so deep. Think about this for a moment. If you had a friend, a real friend, someone who understood you, who had been through hard times alongside you, and that friend became enormously successful, would you expect them to pretend they didn't know you? Would you expect them to erase you from their story the moment you were no longer useful? Most people watching right now would say no, and Rosie said no too. She just didn't realize that Ellen had already made a very different choice. The Larry King moment that changed everything. Here is where the story gets painful, and I want you to really sit with this moment because it explains everything that came after. In 2004, Ellen appeared on Larry King Live. It was a standard celebrity interview, the kind that happens hundreds of times a year. Larry King, doing what Larry King always did, brought up Rosie O'Donnell's talk show, which had ended under difficult circumstances, and he asked Ellen about her friendship with Rosie. What Ellen said in that moment was not a slip of the tongue. It was not a misunderstanding. Rosie herself has recounted exactly what happened. Larry King asked whatever happened to Rosie O'Donnell, essentially suggesting her show had failed. And Ellen's response, on national television, in front of millions of viewers, was simply, "I don't know. We're not friends." Rosie has said that this was one of the most painful things that ever happened to her in her entire career. Not because the friendship was over, friendships end, but because of how it was done, publicly, casually. Like 30 years of genuine human connection was something Ellen could just shrug off in a single sentence to get a laugh from a late-night host. Just like that, gone. Now ask yourself this: why would someone do that? Why, when given the opportunity to simply say something neutral, something kind, something that didn't throw a longtime friend under the bus on national television, would Ellen choose to do the opposite? Some people said it was carelessness. Some said Ellen just didn't think about it. But Rosie didn't see it that way. And the more you look at who Ellen had become by 2004, the harder it is to chalk this up to a simple mistake. By that point, Ellen's talk show was exploding in popularity. She was being welcomed into a completely different tier of Hollywood. Private planes, exclusive gatherings, a social circle that didn't include people from her past, people who remembered her before the money, before the fame, before the access to elite circles that her new status suddenly made available. Rosie watched this transformation happen in real time. She watched Ellen shed her old life like a skin, replacing the people who knew the real her with people who only knew the brand. And Rosie understood something important in that moment on Larry King. She understood that the way Ellen had treated her was probably the way Ellen treated everyone once they stopped being useful. Once you were no longer a stepping stone, you became invisible, or worse, an inconvenience. The way she treated me must be the way she treats others, Rosie has said publicly. And she felt, in her own words, very betrayed. The double life. Be kind on camera. Something else entirely off it. Here is where the story takes a turn that goes well beyond a friendship falling apart. For years after the Larry King incident, Ellen's public profile only grew. The Ellen DeGeneres Show became a cultural institution. She was giving away cars, surprising veterans, dancing with celebrities, telling everyone at home to be kind to one another. The brand was airtight, the smile was constant, and the ratings were extraordinary. But behind the scenes, a very different picture was forming, and it didn't stay hidden forever. In 2020, a wave of former employees and staff members came forward with accounts of what it was actually like to work on the Ellen DeGeneres Show. What they described wasn't a warm, inclusive, joyful workplace. It was the opposite. Multiple investigations were launched. BuzzFeed News published detailed accounts from over a dozen current and former employees describing a toxic work culture, racial insensitivity, fear, and intimidation. Among the claims that emerged, employees were reportedly forbidden from making direct eye contact with Ellen herself. One account described a makeup artist attempting to make small talk with Ellen, only to be met with the response, "Who do you think you are? Don't look at me." Staff members described feeling afraid, undervalued, and silenced. People were allegedly fired for taking medical leave. Complaints were ignored or punished. And here is the part that Hollywood insiders keep pointing to. This wasn't a surprise to the people in the industry. Brad Garrett, the well-known comedian and actor, publicly stated that Ellen's real behavior had been known throughout Hollywood for years. Leah Thompson said the same thing. Margaret Cho came forward. Dakota Johnson came forward. Multiple people in entertainment who had direct experience with Ellen or had heard about her behavior confirmed the same basic truth. The public persona and the private reality were two completely different things. The question that nobody in the mainstream media was willing to ask loudly enough was this: if so many people in Hollywood knew, why did it take this long for it to come out? And who was making sure it stayed quiet? Twitch, Anne Heche, and the human cost. This is the part of the story that I want you to pay close attention to because it goes beyond workplace culture and into something far more serious. Stephen Twitch Boss was the DJ on the Ellen DeGeneres Show for years. He was beloved, warm, talented, genuinely kind in a way that everyone who met him seemed to notice immediately. When the workplace scandal broke in 2020, there were reports that Ellen put pressure on people around her, including Twitch, to publicly defend her, to go out and say that she was a good person, that the stories weren't accurate, that the show was a wonderful place to work. Twitch's wife, Allison Holker, has spoken openly about the enormous pressures her husband was carrying in the period leading up to his death. She has described a man who was hiding things, who was wrestling with things internally that he didn't feel able to share, who was trying to cope with feelings he couldn't put into words. In December 2022, Twitch passed away. He was 36 years old. Now, I am not going to tell you that Ellen DeGeneres is directly responsible for what happened to Twitch. That is not what the evidence supports, and it would be wrong to claim otherwise. But what I am saying is this: when you force people who work for you to publicly defend behavior that may have caused them harm, when you create an environment where people feel they cannot be honest about their own experiences, the consequences of that pressure are real. They land on real human beings. And Twitch was a real human being who was carrying a lot. Then there is Anne Heche, Ellen's former girlfriend, a relationship that was itself a landmark moment in terms of gay visibility in Hollywood during the late 1990s. Anne and Ellen ended their relationship, and in interviews Anne was candid about the differences between them, including different ideas about what they each wanted from life. Anne Heche passed away in August 2022, following a car accident in Los Angeles. She was 53 years old. Reports emerged afterward that at the time of her death, Anne had been working on a documentary project that would have addressed her time with Ellen and the world she had been part of during that relationship. The project was never completed. Is that a sinister coincidence? I genuinely don't know. What I do know is that the people who have spent time looking into Ellen's broader circle keep finding the same thing: people who knew things, people who were in positions to speak, and people whose voices were ultimately silenced, one way or another. The Epstein files and Ellen's name. Now we get to the part that has the internet on fire and has been driving massive conversation over the past year. Jeffrey Epstein, the financier and convicted offender whose network of powerful, wealthy, high-profile associates became one of the most significant and disturbing stories in modern American history. When Epstein died in federal custody in 2019, and when the subsequent unsealing of documents began, including names, flight logs, communications, and testimony, the world started getting a clearer picture of just how wide that network really was. Ellen DeGeneres' name appears in the broader Epstein investigative materials, that is, documented. Her name is among a list of over 300 high-profile individuals whose names surface across the various documents: flight logs, peripheral records, third-party communications, investigative indexes.
Hey, teachers, because most
investigative indexes. Now, I want to be precise here, because precision matters. Being named in those documents does not automatically mean what some corners of the internet are claiming it means. A list of 300 names includes people with varying degrees of connection. Some were deeply involved, some had peripheral contact, some may have attended events without any knowledge of what was happening around them. The documents themselves are complex and require careful reading. What those documents do tell us, and this is important, is that access to Epstein's world was not random. It was not accidental. You did not end up in Jeffrey Epstein's orbit by coincidence. These were curated, intentional relationships built around wealth, influence, and access. The social architecture of that world was deliberately constructed, and Ellen, by the time her name surfaces in any of this context, had spent years building exactly the kind of profile that gave her entry into elite circles, private flights, exclusive gatherings, a social world that ordinary people like the staff on her show, people like Rosie O'Donnell, were simply not part of. The connection between Ellen and Diddy has also drawn attention, given what has subsequently emerged about Diddy's own legal situation and the federal investigations surrounding him. Multiple clips have resurfaced of interactions on the Ellen DeGeneres show that, in retrospect, read very differently than they did at the time. Jokes that weren't quite jokes, references that seemed innocent then, but carry different weight now. Ellen was not just passively associated with certain people. Her show was a platform. And platforms have power. When you repeatedly bring someone into your living room, into the living rooms of millions of viewers, you are doing more than booking a guest. You are lending your credibility to them. You are normalizing them. You are, whether intentionally or not, serving as a bridge between them and mainstream acceptance. Rosie makes her move. So where does Rosie O'Donnell fit into all of this? Last year, Rosie did something that caught a lot of people off guard. She moved to Ireland. Not a vacation, not a temporary relocation. She moved, she left the United States, left Hollywood, and settled in a country on the other side of the Atlantic Ocean. And then, from that new location, from that distance, she posted a statement on Instagram, a long, pointed statement. And right there alongside it, she posted a photograph of Jeffrey Epstein. Let that land for a moment. A woman who spent 30 years in Hollywood, who was inside those elite circles at a certain level, who had watched Ellen's transformation from peer to something else entirely, That woman posted a photograph of Jeffrey Epstein alongside a personal statement about where she stood. That was not an accident. That was not casual. That was a deliberate signal. When Ellen saw that post, she apparently understood exactly what it meant, because her response was immediate. She publicly shared Rosie's post with a caption reading, "Good for you, Rosie." Think about the timeline here. Ellen had dismissed Rosie on national television in 2004. She had cut her out of her life entirely. She had, by multiple accounts, actively used her industry influence in ways that did not benefit Rosie's career. 20 years of silence, and suddenly, the moment Rosie posts something involving Epstein's name, Ellen is publicly applauding her? That is not the behavior of someone who suddenly rediscovered their affection for an old friend. That is the behavior of someone who is very aware of what that old friend knows, and who is desperately trying to appear supportive before the story gets worse. Rosie did not respond warmly. And why would she? By moving to Ireland, Rosie has done something strategically significant, whether she intended it that way or not. She has placed herself outside the reach of the Hollywood machine, outside the media ecosystem that controls narratives in Los Angeles, outside the social and professional pressure systems that have kept so many people quiet for so long. She cannot be blacklisted from an industry she has already left. She cannot be pressured by people whose influence no longer touches her daily life. And she has made it very clear, through her actions and her public statements, that she is not afraid. Ellen's panic, the fire sale, and the flight. Here is where Ellen's behavior becomes genuinely difficult to explain away. As the Epstein files continued to generate headlines, and as her name kept surfacing in online investigations, Ellen and her wife Portia de Rossi began doing something that financial analysts and legal observers found very notable. They started liquidating assets. Quickly, the California Blufftop estate sold for $96 million. The beach bungalow in Montecito, originally listed at $29 million, then pulled from the market, then relisted at $33.9 million, then dropped back down to the original asking price in what appeared to be a sudden urgency to just get it sold, went to gone. The art collection, works by Jean-Michel Basquiat, one of the most valuable painters of the 20th century, custom sculptures valued at approximately $1 million each. An estimated $10 million worth of art moved quickly, in what observers described not as a curated auction strategy, but as a fire sale. Get the cash, get it now. And then they left. Ellen and Portia relocated to England, to a rural property in the Cotswolds, approximately 2 hours outside London. A stone house, quiet, remote, far from cameras, far from studios, far from anyone asking questions. The public explanation given, reported by multiple outlets including TMZ, was that the move was driven by the political climate in the United States. Ellen was reportedly disillusioned by the presidential election results and wanted distance from the chaos, except that timeline doesn't hold up, because according to reporting that emerged afterward, Ellen and Portia had actually purchased their English property months before the election in question even took place. They had been planning this move well in advance of any political outcome. The political narrative was applied after the fact, a convenient story to tell the public, a way of framing a departure that had nothing to do with voting results and everything to do with what was coming down the pipeline legally and publicly. They weren't fleeing politics. They were fleeing exposure. And Ellen's neighbors in England, according to reports from people familiar with the area, have not exactly rolled out the welcome mat. There is apparently significant local resentment about high-profile celebrities moving into what has historically been a quiet, private, community-oriented area. Ellen, according to those reports, is not popular in her new surroundings. She exchanged one kind of exile for another. The bigger picture, how Hollywood protects itself. Here is the thing about powerful institutions. When they feel threatened, they do not collapse immediately. They circle the wagons. They flood the zone with noise. They release carefully worded statements. They remind you that being named on a list isn't the same as being convicted of anything. They get very precise and very technical about what evidence actually proves, and they use that precision as a shield. We saw this happen in real time as Ellen's name began circulating in Epstein-related conversations. Multiple outlets published pieces noting that Ellen was one name among hundreds in a broad index of people connected to various aspects of the investigation. They were careful, they were measured, they made sure to include the caveat that inclusion on a list does not imply wrongdoing. All of that is technically accurate, and it is also exactly what you would expect from a system designed to protect its own members. Because here is the thing that those careful, measured pieces don't address. When we are talking about Epstein's world, access was everything. His network was not a public gathering. It was a deliberately curated, deliberately private community of people who had been specifically chosen for inclusion. Understanding that context changes how we read any name that appears in those documents. What we know, not speculatively, but based on documented behavior, is that Ellen spent years building a profile that gave her entry to exactly those kinds of spaces. She cultivated relationships with extremely powerful, extremely wealthy people. She attended private gatherings, she flew private, she moved in circles that were invisible to the public, but very visible to the people inside them. Whether or not a court ever rules on what Ellen did or didn't do in those circles, the behavioral evidence of the past 2 years tells its own story. Innocent people do not liquidate $10 million in art and $100 million in property in a matter of months. Innocent people do not flee to another country and quietly purchase a rural retreat before the story they're afraid of has even fully broken. Innocent people do not suddenly start publicly supporting the friend they betrayed 20 years ago, the precise moment that friend posts a photograph of Jeffrey Epstein. Behavior is data, and Ellen's behavior over the past 2 years is some of the most data-rich behavior we have seen from anyone connected to this story. What Rosie represents. There is something genuinely significant about what Rosie O'Donnell has done, beyond the specifics of this particular story. For 30 years, she was someone who knew things. She was inside the industry. She saw the gap between the public image and the private reality. She experienced firsthand what it felt like to be discarded by someone who had decided that loyalty was only useful until it wasn't. And for most of those 30 years, she processed that privately. She talked about her own feelings in interviews. She acknowledged the betrayal, but she didn't blow the whole thing up. Something changed. And I think what changed is that the cost of staying quiet started to feel higher than the cost of speaking. When the Epstein files started dropping, when names started surfacing, when the architecture of that dark network started becoming visible to ordinary people who'd never had access to it before, the calculus shifted. Rosie O'Donnell is not a perfect person. Nobody is. She has her own complicated history, her own public controversies, but what she represents in this moment is something important. She is someone who was there, who knows the difference between the performance and the reality, and who has decided, from the safety of a country that cannot touch her professionally, to be honest about what she saw. The beast we're fighting is not just one person, Rosie has said publicly. It's a big cabal of powerful people, and it's time to end it. That's not a small thing to say. That's not someone making a casual comment about celebrity culture. That is someone who spent 30 years watching how the machine works, and who has decided that the machine needs to be visible to the people it has been hiding from. Where we are now. Ellen DeGeneres is living in the English countryside. The show is over. The Be Kind brand is gone. Not just ended, but discredited. The sponsors have moved on. The cultural moment has passed. The woman who once commanded the most watched daytime talk show slot in American television is now sitting in a stone house in rural England. And according to every available piece of reporting, she has no plans to return. That is a remarkable fall, and it didn't happen because of politics, or because of election results, or because America changed in ways she couldn't accept. It happened because the gap between the performance and the reality became too wide to maintain. It happened because the people who knew what was behind the curtain started, one by one, deciding they were done protecting it. Rosie O'Donnell was one of those people. She was inside that world. She watched the transformation. She experienced the betrayal. And when she moved to Ireland and posted that photograph of Jeffrey Epstein alongside a personal statement, she was not being random or reckless. She was sending a message to everyone who needed to receive it. The message was, I'm outside your reach now, and I'm not done talking. We don't know yet exactly what Rosie knows. We don't know what she will say next, what documents she may have access to, what conversations from those 30 years of Hollywood access are stored in her memory. But we do know that she has positioned herself very deliberately, outside the machine, outside the pressure, outside the ecosystem that has kept these stories buried for decades. And the people who should be most worried about that are exactly the people who have the most to lose when the full story finally comes out. What do you think? Did Hollywood protect Ellen DeGeneres for too long? Do you think Rosie O'Donnell is going to say more? And who else in that industry do you think knew about the gap between the public image and the private reality and stayed quiet anyway? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. Share this video with someone who needs to hear this story. And subscribe if you haven't already, because this story is not over, not by a long way.